I'm really pleased to be joined on Not the Andrew Marr Show by Chris Mullin, who is MP for Sunderland South from 1987 to 2010, was the former chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee and minister in 3 departments, author of 4 novels, including Very British Coup and its sequel, The Friends of Harry Perkins. He's written 3 diaries, volumes of diaries, and he's got a new volume of diaries out just now this week, which I got my hands on and had a good look at, but I've read it. This is Didn't You Used to Be Chris Mullin, diaries from 2010 till 2022, which is fascinating to read. That period is incredible in history. I think it will go down in history as an incredible period. So it's just reading it, you get back all this stuff that you've forgotten about, and it's incredible. Now, what I did want to ask you about, really, I wanted to ask you about the quality of journalism. I mean, you've gone to court, nearly threatened, I suppose, with prison for not revealing a source from that incredible Granada investigation into the Birmingham Six, which is a landmark in journalism. How do you see journalists now? Do you think we have that kind of principled truth finders that I mean, obviously you're an example of? Do you think that that's lacking at the moment?
No, I think there's always been some of each. I'm afraid to say our tabloid press is as bad, if not worse, as it ever was. But there's always been principled journalists around, and also people who, contrary to their political prejudices, actually, if they see a story that needs telling, doing so. Peter Oborne, I would suggest, is an example of that. Basically, a Tory journalist who's come out very strongly on, for example, an issue dear to the hearts of your listeners, the treatment of Jeremy Corbyn.
I mean, that's probably what I'm focused on most on this, but the way that the media treated Jeremy Corbyn in the run up to, in all his leadership, throughout his leadership,
it's called monstering. That's a Daily Mail term for it, and it happens to anybody who defies the consensus. At the most intense period, at least until the Corbyn era, was the onslaught unleashed on Tony Benn, when it looked as though he might become leader of the Labour Party. And of course, anybody who puts their head above the parapet on a controversial issue, Arthur Scargill's another that comes to mind, gets monstered. And Corbyn got the full treatment. In fact, I would say he got rather more even than Tony Benn.
Do you think Tony Benn would have been able to handle it better, or do you think you just can't handle that stuff?
I think that Jeremy was more vulnerable than Tony Benn. Tony Benn had been in the government for 12 years, remember. He was also probably the most articulate politician of his age. So there were some wonderful moments when he came under attack on various television programs, when he turned the interview completely round on the people who were giving him grief. There's really some classic ones. There's a wonderful World in Action during the Chesterfield by-election, in which the Sun tried to monster him, and it backfired badly on them. Yeah.
I mean, you do pay a lot of tributes throughout to Jeremy Corbyn's character and how unfair it is on him. And you weren't at the start of the Corbyn kind of movement in 2015. You weren't sure that he could handle the leadership at all. But did you think that he did well, better than you would have expected before he became leader?
Well, yes, it's quite right. I'm not a Corbynista in the sense that I didn't vote for him in the leadership election, and I thought it wasn't a very good idea to elect him. And my expectations were indeed quite low. Though I've known Jeremy for 40 years, and he's a thoroughly decent human being, and that's always been my position as regards Jeremy. So did he do better than I expected? Well, he certainly did in the 2017 election, yes, without any shadow of doubt. But I never thought that he could become Prime Minister. And if he had become Prime Minister, I'm afraid to say he'd been a big disappointment, because I don't think, I think he'd have been a hopeless Prime Minister, to be perfectly honest. But he's a thoroughly decent human being, and I deprecate the way he's been treated, not only by the media, but by Keir Starmer subsequently.
I mean, with that, you know, it does come across in your diaries about the sort of the Corbynistas, as you say, sort of attacking you in on some occasions because you're not speaking up for Jeremy enough. Do you think that was it's not a tactical thing, it's kind of an emotional attack on you more than anything else? But do those backfire if people who support Jeremy sort of have a dig at someone who's not on their side? Or do you think that's just water off a duck's back?
Well, I can always deal with rational argument. I'm happy to engage, but of course, he did attract some individuals who just unleashed abuse on anybody who they didn't like particularly. That happens on Twitter, on social media in general, but on Twitter. I'm completely immune to it. I mean, I've had some of the causes I've taken up in life, not least that of the 6 innocent people convicted of the Birmingham pub bombings. I've had enormous quantities of abuse heaped on me, and I still get some. So it's completely, as you say, water off a duck's back. But I'm always willing to respond to rational argument.
I mean, it seems like the left versus right in the Labour Party really came, you know, this division really came out once Jeremy was on the ballot paper in 2015. Is this the most divided Labour Party you can remember?
Well, the Labour Party has a penchant for civil wars, and we had one in the 1950s, Bevonites versus Gateschalites. We certainly had one in the 70s when Tony Benn was in the ascendant, and when the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, of which I was a member, was in the ascendant. And indeed, we had another one following the election of Jeremy, and I thought that some MPs behaved extremely badly. The great difficulty with Jeremy's leadership was in a parliamentary democracy, it doesn't really make sense to elect a leader who, for better or for worse, only has the support of about 10 or 15% of the MPs. And that makes it almost impossible to govern, and so it proved.
Right, so that was kind of why you thought it was not going to work in the first place.
Well, that indeed, I knew from the outset that it wouldn't work. I certainly think some people behave very badly, but that's neither here nor there in the big picture. Just electing someone who doesn't have the support of, or at least the acceptance, not necessarily support, of a majority of the MPs, it makes it very difficult, if not impossible.
So I'm just talking about the sort of treatment of Jeremy Corbyn. This is in your diaries. This is the Friday, the 30th of October. This should be 2020, I think. Keir Starmer has withdrawn the whip from Jeremy Corbyn for suggesting, in response to a report from the Equalities Commission, that allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party have been exaggerated by people with a different agenda. As it happens, I agree with Jeremy. The proposition is not difficult to illustrate. To take but one example, most of those named in Margaret Hodges' much publicised dossier of alleged anti-Semites turn out not to be members of the Labour Party. What's more, the handful of cases highlighted by the Commission's report as having been mishandled occurred at a time when party headquarters was firmly in the hands of Corbyn's sworn enemies. I feel angry about this. Corbyn was never leadership material. He's a good and decent man, and it upsets me to see him cynically thrown to the wolves. The first time in more than 50 years, having stuck with the Labour Party through thick and thin, I begin to wonder if I still belong in it. And that's. I mean, I saw that. I had to say a picture of that as such a big statement to make at the end. I feel personally that the treatment of Jeremy Corbyn has been very dishonest and has led me to feel the Labour Party has got no integrity. How do you feel now? I mean, that was a while ago that you wrote that.
Well, I haven't changed my opinion about what happened, but I don't think it's the only issue. I mean, the big picture is that we can't go on under permanent Conservative government, and even a flawed Labour government is likely to be better than another 5 years of Tory government. The Tories, bear in mind, I mean, one hears it alleged that Labour was at one time taken over by the cult of Jeremy. Don't let's get into that debate, but the Tories were certainly taken over by a cult, and they're still at it now. That so-called, what do they call the European? What are they called? The European Reform Group? No, they're not.
Yeah, I think it's that. Yeah, ERG.
ERG, yes, that's them. Yes, and I see they popped up in another incarnation. They're having a conference at the moment, I think, aren't they? These people, if they get their way, will do even more damage to the people that the Labour Party was founded to care about. And so we mustn't lose sight of the big picture.
Right. However, I mean, you know, if the Labour Party is taking the whip away from someone who's an anti-racist and calling him a racist, is that not a bad sign of what maybe a Starmer government would be like? Do you feel, for example, that his authoritarianism within the Labour Party, and also with some of the bills that have passed that he's not checked, like the Spy Cops one, do you not fear that he'd be more of a danger in terms of taking our freedoms away of expression and finding funny, ridiculous reasons to silence people, prescribing groups as well, all this kind of stuff? Is it not a concern to you about him?
Well, it is a concern, but I don't accept that he'd be in some way worse than the present management, who've inflicted enormous damage on the country, and especially and the gap between the impoverished and the prosperous is getting wider and wider. So yes, it's a concern, but it's not. I saw somebody interviewed on your website a while ago describing Starmer as evil. I don't happen to buy that either. I think he won't be very brave as Prime Minister, and yes, I think he's likely to be, well, he is behaving in an authoritarian fashion, but he's not the first authoritarian leader of the Labour Party we've had, and I don't suppose he'll be the last.
I mean, you also mentioned, like you say, that there is a lot of need for a change in government, because of the poverty that we've got all over the country, the people who are on 0 hours contracts, people like you see begging near to where you live. Does Starmer actually have the policies to change the society for what we need it to be? I mean, well, I can't see much other than attracting the middle class and the sort of middle England that he keeps going on about.
I don't think Labour can form a government without attracting some of middle England. If we just scale off the middle classes, then we're doomed. You cannot, surely the one big lesson we've learned in the last 50 years is that you cannot hope to form a government unless you can take not every last Daily Mail reader, but a fair swathe of middle England with you. And that's, I think, something that the strongest supporters of Jeremy Corbyn sometimes overlook.
I would say, do you think that that Starmer is in some way playing to the right in order, and then when he gets in, he'll be a more radical sort of Labour socialist type figure?
Not necessarily, but even a very moderate disappointing Labour government would be better than the ideologues who are in power at the moment. I can see you're sceptical, and I have no doubt that most of those who watch your channel are sceptical, but they need to wise up.
Oh, right, okay.
This is
right,
a film
well,
we've seen before. It's not the first time. I mean, we've seen this film before.
well, let me move on to something else, because I can hear what you're saying there. It's quite clear. The other issue that I note that you stick your neck out on, which many people don't, is the anti-Semitism smears that have been used, where people are if people are critical of Israel, they're being called anti-Semitic, effectively. Now, this is part of your diaries here. The online news agency Middle East Eye has published my lengthy piece on the weaponisation of anti-Semitism, which in the current climate could never be published in the UK. Comments so far generally agreeable. My Tory friend Andrew Mitchell writes a superb piece venturing where most fear to tread and elegantly navigating the rapids without ducking the issues. But there was also this: I'm so disgusted with Mullin that I threw all his books away, didn't even take them to a charity shop. I'll never buy another. I mean, that is a...
Well, that's the price you pay for sticking your neck out on a controversial issue. I had an email from a woman the other day who once sent me an email saying how wonderful my earlier volumes of diaries were. But when she read my views on the anti-Semitism debate, she chucked all 3 volumes of them in the bin. She didn't even take them to a charity shop, she said. Well, it's very difficult to argue rationally with someone in that frame of mind, and I don't really attempt to do so. For what it's worth, my position on the allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party are that it was a problem, that it wasn't dealt with very well, but it wasn't a very big problem either, and that it was weaponized, as I said in the diaries, by those who had a different agenda, and it became about getting rid of Jeremy as leader.
Right. It's been, for me personally, it's been a very painful thing to even speak about this issue at all. So I appreciate your speaking out at all on it, because it's so
toxic that it brings down a great shower of shite on your head, as I discovered more than once. Yes, yeah. It is very painful. I notice, however, that those in charge of purging the Labour Party at the moment have expelled quite a large number of Jews, some of whose I think they're members of a pro-Palestinian Jewish group called Jewish Voice for Labour, and some of those who've been expelled have families who died in the death camps. So that's the trouble with purges. They start usually with some obscure Trotskyist sect, and then they get out of hand. And I would say this one's got out of hand, and they need to rein it in.